Hi, everybody. Yeah, like you said, I work for an organization here in town called Archaeology Southwest, and we're a nonprofit, and we're about preserving and protecting archaeological sites, and we put out a magazine. So I didn't bring any with me today, but oftentimes we have them. I'll have them at Steam Pump Ranch. So many of you are probably familiar with our pit house that we have built there at Steam Pump Ranch. That is a replica of a Hohokam period house that about 900 years in age range, and that is much more recent than what I'm going to be talking about here today. But I will be out there this coming Saturday with outreach, and we'll have tables set up. You can go in the pit house and look at the pit house and check it out, and you can ask me more questions. And I think you can ask me questions after I'm kind of done talking today. I blibber blabber a long time, so. And if you don't hear me, just let me know. I'll speak up a little louder, talking about the room. Today, what I'm going to talk about is what we call now the early agricultural time period here in Tucson, Arizona. So everybody's pretty familiar with the Hohokam stuff, the folks that were living here, that you see their sites everywhere. So if you go out to Catalina State Park, you can go to Romero Ruins, and you can see that really nicely preserved village in there. What I'm going to talk about is the folks that were here before that, and very much likely they are the ancestors, or they are the precursors to the Hohokam. So these are the same peoples basically, but just later in time. So we start calling folks the Hohokam when they start making pottery and painting the pottery. So this early ag stuff that I'm talking about is back about beyond 1,500 years ago to 2,000 years ago is when we start calling it that. People were not using the bow and arrow yet, and they were not making pottery containers for storage. So the big thing that in the early ag time periods, the big thing that ties them together with the later what we call the Hohokam groups is that they were growing corn. Corn comes in first. And so this is a picture of an ear of chocolate corn it's a popcorn, and it has pretty small ears. This is considered to be probably the closest example of what the early corn would have looked like here. So we, for the longest time, have been saying, from dates that we've gotten from sites that we've excavated down along the Santa Cruz River here in Tucson, we've been saying that we had dates that were putting corn here about 4,000 years ago. Well, from some more work that was just recently done in the last 2 or 3 years off of Ina Road, there where Ina and the interstate kind of cross in that area, and there's that big sewer plant in there, we call that site the Los Capas site. And at that site, some recent work down deep in there, they got some new dates on corn that are bordering on 5,000 years ago. So we just keep pushing it back. It's pretty amazing. So what I'm going to talk about today and show you in a bunch of these slides here is kind of how we find what we have found to learn about these early agriculturalists here in Tucson, and some of the techniques we use to find them, and then I'll show you some of the artifacts and talk about all that stuff. And if you really need to, you can ask me a question, but I'll try to keep rolling through it. But this picture right here is a good example of what the early ag corn would have looked like when we find it. And so make sure I'm going the right way. So here's a couple pictures of this is the Los Capas archaeological site, which is, like I said, down off of Ina and the interstate there. And so every time because the city of Tucson just keeps growing and growing and growing, every few number of years they have to expand the sewer plants, because if there's one thing you don't want to have not enough capability to deal with is the sewage, raw sewage. So they keep expanding the plants. So here at Ina and the interstate there was a really great place for people prehistorically. What happened is that's a spot where the Rillito and the CDO rivers run into the Santa Cruz River, and they dump their loads of gravels and sands into the river. What it did was it created somewhat of a natural sort of a dam in the river. So it allowed the water table to come up to be very high to the surface. So much of the year through that stretch, there would be actually water above ground running through the river. The river was not entrenched like it is now. So we're talking, you go back in time to about 2,000 years ago, the floodplain was flat pretty much all the way across with the river meandering around in there. So people could go in and they could dig canals out of that river and run them out onto the flat floodplain. And so that spot at Ina and on the interstate there at Los Capas was really great. And for archaeologists, it was also really fantastic because one of the things that happens because of that is that every year there would be floods that would bury the fields and things, so which sort of helps us to be able to find them. And I'm going to go into that into a lot more detail. So how do we find early agricultural sites in the first place? They're not so obvious. Archaeologists, when people were starting to work down here, they never really paid attention to this earlier stuff. They were looking for sherds and ceramics. So they were looking on these sites that tend to be up on the foothills and not down in the bottom of the floodplains. We discovered that early agricultural sites tend to be down actually in the floodplains. The people are actually living down in the bottoms. So not until we started paying attention to that did we really notice it. And then there are early agricultural villages up on the terrace tops, but in most cases they're capped by later Hohokam sites. And so we can't see them as clearly. There's certain artifact types that we find through time in these sites that are diagnostic of that. The big one is sherds. When you see sherds, sherds, we start to see pottery coming in about 1,200 years ago. And the earliest pottery was not decorated. It was just brownware, and they were making jars that didn't have rims on them. And then over the next 100, 150, 200 years, they start to paint them. And when they start to paint them is when we start to call them the Hohokam, which is just a word we put on them. It means nothing. Their ancestors are the modern O'odham tribes that are living here in this part of the world. Now, one of the things to think about is that there were multiple migrations. So you have a group living here, and then you have new groups coming up from the south moving through. Some groups moved up on the Colorado Plateau. So this archaeology I'm going to be talking about today, a lot of it resembles the ancestral Puebloan stuff as well, a lot. And so they're closely related. So this slide right here, it just shows these people are walking on a terrace, probably up above a river somewhere, and they're looking for artifacts. They're not looking for, well, it depends on what you're doing. If you're doing survey as an archaeologist, you're looking for all artifacts, historic, prehistoric, whatever you find. But the artifacts tell you what might be in that village, what might be there. So you look for certain things. This type of projectile point is called a San Pedro, and it's a very typical projectile point in the early agricultural time period. And we see these all over the place, but when you see something like that, you know you got some earlier stuff going on there. And we know this from excavations, how old these are, what the time frame is of their age, and what the people were doing to make a living at that point in time. So once we've got a site, we know where a site is at, if it's in the floodplain, and there's going to be development. So we don't just go out and look for sites to dig. There has to be some kind of project going on where there's monies. So it's generally federal, or there's a developer or something's doing a project that they know is going to be in a known archaeological site. And so before the work can go on, the first thing we do is we go out with a backhoe and we dig trenches like this right here. And we look at the cross sections, the dirt in the floodplain or wherever we're at, and we're looking for features. We're looking for things like pit houses and pits and things. And what we have in the floodplains in Tucson is that we have layers. There's layer after layer after layer after layer. So what's on the surface of the ground is not necessarily any indication of what is below you. And you can go through several different cultural layers in these locations. So unless there's been disturbance kicking up sherds or kicking up flakestone artifacts, we might not know that there's an archaeological site there at all until we get in and look. So a lot of projects, the first thing we do is go out and dig backhoe trenches. In the floodplain, other technologies don't work. We just got to get in there and look at it with our eyes. So this is to give you an idea of when I mentioned that there's multiple layers of stuff. And so when we are in the floodplain and we're digging, this is a profile right here from over at the Los Capas site. And this shows you all these layers that we have numbered and labeled so we can understand what we're looking at. And after a period of time, we can recognize them. So when there are floods, when there's in the summertime or in the wintertime, when there's huge storms and it rains everywhere, and you get a lot of water coming down the rivers, back in those days they weren't entrenched, so the water would spread out across the floodplain, and it would drop the sediments from the different areas in the floods. So at Los Capas, all these different layers in here represent, and each layer represents multiple floods. You can kind of see micro, smaller little layers in there. So each one of those layers is from a flood when it dropped its sediments down across the floodplain. So we learned that 504, in this level, you find, like, this is a level that you find the Cienega stuff, and the very top of it you find the Hohokam stuff and the later Spanish. So down on the floodplain in the Santa Cruz, it's the upper layers that are all of that stuff. But once you start going down and you get down to the bottom of the 504 and going into the 505, you're in the early ag. And that's where we find these earlier sites. And they're all over. The floodplain is just loaded with them. They're everywhere. And so this right here, once we go into the early ag, we don't have ceramics to tell us how old they are. One of our best things is the projectile points, they tell us, and carbon. So these represent hearths, features that you might find in there. And we get the dates from the charcoal from these features. So if we dig enough features in a layer, we get a pretty good idea, the age range of that layer from people living there. And so the oldest, the latest projectile point styles that we get in that early ag time period we call Cienega. And Cienega it's a transition. From Cienega, right after that is when ceramics come in. They're building little round houses. We had a replica of one at Steam Pump Ranch for a number of years that we burned down. Some of you were probably there, may have seen it. It was really cool. And then when you go back in time a little further, you go into the San Pedro time period, and you get these kinds of projectile points. So the difference between these Cienega points right here, the big thing in Cienega that happened is that the bow and arrow comes in. So we see this shift into these much smaller projectile points. We go back in time, before the bow and arrow, all the projectile points are much larger. These were used with the atlatl and darts. And so I have some examples of those I brought. At the end of the talk, you guys can come up and look at that stuff. So once we get into this San Pedro time period, it lasts a long time. It's a long time period, and then you go through that into the early San Pedro, we get these empire points, and below those we have Cortaro, and now Cortaro, below them, there's another layer that I don't have on this thing yet that we barely understand. We just don't know much about it. But that's the earliest, folks, that when the corn is first coming in. So it's like the further back you go in time, the less the amount of people and the less of those sites there are and the less of that stuff is. So it's much harder for us to find. We have to get kind of lucky to find it. Oh, pushing the wrong button. There we go. So I wanted to give you guys an idea of what we're doing. So in these pictures here, once we've got these trenches dug, we've opened up these things, we spend a lot of time looking at the soil and the layers in there. And it's kind of, this one's a really cool one right here. If you look really carefully, you see this D-shaped thing right here. This is the bottom of a big canal, a good-sized canal. And so, if you look carefully, it's kind of hard to tell. The canal comes up to almost this elevation here, and then there's a bump and a berm right here. So this is a canal that was bringing water out of the river out into the fields. And we have them everywhere. Fred here, he's the soil geomorphologist that did a lot of the work for us out there, and he is working on a much smaller little ditch, a field ditch that was out in the fields. And so he is drawing lines in the dirt representing the different layers and the different things. This canal is pretty cool because it was filled in with a flood. This is a very white, clean sand that filled it in from a fast-moving flood. Blanketed. They reused it. Up here is another dig out and a reuse of it. And I'll go into that a lot more, but we look at that dirt and we look at it carefully. We scrape it with really sharp trowels and we just break it down to micro layers. And over the years working in the projects, every project we do, we kept pushing it back further and further and further. Like, oh, we got new dates, and it's older and older, and it was super exciting. So here's another thing. So this is a later time period site. This is an early ceramic time period site down near A Mountain, down in that area. And this is an example of an excavated pit house. But we saw the pit house in the trench. So this is the original trench we dug, and then we could see the fill inside the house. So then we went back in and we dug it by hand. And you can see there's artifacts sitting on the floor of it, and then that's the entryway out right there. So in the floodplain, when we're digging down in the floodplain and we start to look, we learned that we could see agricultural fields. This gentleman running the backhoe right here, his name is Dan Arnett, and that's all he does is archaeology backhoe work. And he built this blade, and it's just a giant, it's a big metal blade with a bar on the end, a scraping bar here that he sharpens like you'd cut your finger if you ran it down it. But he can cut the dirt and he can scrape it. So it's like using a giant trowel. So we can scrape in the floodplain with it, and we do a pattern, and you scrape it down, and then we blow it off with blowers. And we can see the fields. We've discovered that we can see the agricultural fields. So there's always an archaeologist, oops, I went the wrong way. There's always an archaeologist standing very near, monitoring the machine in case we come across human remains or looking for features and things so we don't destroy them. Dan's very good. He tends to see the stuff before we even do who are standing there. He's a little higher up. He can see them. But you can see right here behind this gentleman right here with the blower, this line got painted in the ground. So when we first start out, we start to see differences. We see color differences in the soils. And so we start to spray paint those. And over time, as we expand out our excavations, we start to see things like this. So this is a map. This is an excavation map, an infield excavation map we were using. So this is a plot of land right off of Ina, right when you go across the interstate and you're heading down. They built a warehouse on the sewer plant there at Ina. They built this warehouse at the plant for storing materials and things in. So we did this excavation before they built the warehouse. We dug down about 1.50 meters, something like that, down in the bottom layers. This is a layer of agricultural fields that we exposed. And so the first thing you can kind of see here is these are trenches we dug initially that we were looking for agricultural features. When we did these trenches, we could only see these larger canals. This is a large canal right here. There's a larger one right here. There's another bigger one right here. But once we learned that, once we start stripping with the backhoes, we strip down and we can start to see the berms. So every canal had mounds of dirt on each side. And then the fields, the agricultural fields, out in the fields, they had off these ditches, they would dig lateral ditches that ran off the side of those. And then they built little berms around little agricultural field plots. And so what they would do is they would plug the main ditch, run the water down into their little field cells, and they could run it down. And they tend to run with the field cells, they're usually 2 wide, and they go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, or 7 or 8 until you get your next bigger ditch. So it's laid out in a grid pattern. And down there in the Santa Cruz, there are layers upon layers of these things. So with the backhoe, we have to strip really carefully so we can see these. So here's an example of, I was talking about how they made these fields and these ditches. So they would dig a channel into the lower sediments, and they'd use all that dirt and berm them up to create those berms. So we can see that in the cross section. We can see the remnants of layers that were there that they dug out, and we can see the broken up little colored remnants of that strat right there. And so they would run the water out into the fields at a level that was higher than the ground surface. So all they would have to do is just cut a little hole in it and run the water out the side. So the equivalent of it, it's like a garden hose. It's a way of moving the water around in the fields. Because if you can't water a huge area if it's all coming in one little ditch. It's like trying to water your backyard with a hose and running it in one spot. You have to move the hose around. So these ditches and berms were a way of doing that. So here's another example of the dirt dug out, and then these are fields. What happens is you'll have floods, and the flood waters come in, and they will deposit clays into the interiors of the fields. So in the spring, they're running the waters down their ditches into the fields, and we get layers of clay. These are all things that we can see when we're stripping with the backhoe. And so the berm is built out of this lightly colored dirt that's a little mottled, and then there's these clays. So when we're stripping with the backhoe, we cut the top of this off, and we can see stripes everywhere. It's a different color. And so those are what we're painting in these pictures. So this is an example at a site right here where we actually we could excavate the fields three-dimensionally. So we went in, instead of scraping the top off, we actually dug down. So this is the bottom of the ditch, the canal ditch. This is the berm on this side. This is the berm on this side. And then these are fields. There's a berm that runs off here. Another one goes here. And these are big, huge fields in here. So this is a site that's down off of what's the site called? It's not Santa Cruz Bend. It's where we found the footprints. So it's where they built that new road across when they were doing all that work along the interstate. This is where they built that road across. So what they discovered, Dan, this is Dan the backhoe guy right here, he was working in here and he was stripping over the top of one of these berms, and he saw a shape in there. It looked like a footprint. So he hopped out of the tractor and grabbed a blower and with a brush blew it out. You could see the toes, you could see everything. So you could see the footprints of the farmers walking around in these fields. And in this location, you can see there are layers and layers of these layers with footprints in them. Also, the other thing that we can see in here is where these flags are, those are planting pits, the holes they dug to plant the seeds of the corn to grow the corn up. So we can see the full, everything in the fields. They just show up amazingly well. Here's a picture that shows you what I'm talking about. So we've just recently stripped over this surface. We're blowing it off, but can you see that color difference? These are berms right here, and then these are the interiors of the fields. In this location, the interiors of the fields filled up with a lighter colored sediment, more sandy, silty. The berms had more clay in them, so they're darker and they look darker. This area where you don't see any berms, we stripped too deep. We missed it. We went too far. The difference between right here and right here is like that much. It's like 5 centimeters or something. It's like a couple scrapes. What happens is these fields, sometimes these berms, they melt down to they're almost nothing. So we don't have a lot to go with a lot of times if they weather out and they're pretty far gone. This is down off of Ruthroth where this site's at. And we're literally under the east lanes of the interstate where we're working. Eastbound lane, or no, westbound lanes. I'm lying to you, the westbound lanes. We're on the west side. There we go. All right, here's another example looking off the boom as he's digging, scraping, and exposing these fields. So we're just exposing vast areas of dirt, and it's all about the dirt. But it was really cool when we learned we could see that. And this is once again, this is out off of Ina. This is the gas station up, the interstate's right up here. There's the gas station there, and we're out in these fields right here, exposing these. You can see them. This is another view here of that picture, that the fields I showed you that were hand-drawn, the picture of that. This is those same fields, and you can see how complicated it gets. This section of fields was very far out in the field systems, and so the fields are very small. But if you're closer to where there's more water, the fields can be a lot bigger. If you have more head of water, you can water a bigger field cell. These field cells are very small. There's a person standing there. It's hard to see, but there's a person standing there. They're not too big. And then these little berms you see right here are trenches we have across, so we can do the profiles of the canals and draw those so we can see what's going on. Here's another one. I'm kind of into the dirt stuff, so you guys are probably going, ugh. But here's another one where I just wanted to show you. So we haven't spray painted anything right here, but if you look closely, you see there's this, you can see there's a line right here and there's a line right here. This is the interior of a ditch, of a canal or a field ditch. And then this is a berm. See this side to here, that's a berm. And then right here on this side is a berm, which we haven't stripped past, so you can't see much past it. But if you look really close, the other thing you can see in here, later on, they had fields cutting in over the top. See all these little round holes here everywhere? Those are planting pits that cut into these sediments from higher up fields. So what's going on here, though, I don't know if you can tell or not, but right here is another berm that matches this one exactly. So it's a layer of the same ditch or canal that's running along that has been used through multiple flood episodes. So when you have a flood that's not too strong and that flood water spread out across the floodplain, they envelop everything. And then as the flood slows down, it starts dropping its sediments. So the first stuff it drops is the sands, and then the next thing is the silts, and the last thing is the clays. So all of these little bands here represent different floods. And if you look at the top, it's dark, that's the clay. The bottom is the sand, silts, clays, and it's just layer upon layer. They didn't drop enough to obliterate, it didn't drop enough sediments to obliterate the field systems, so the people would just come back, rework it a little bit, and keep using that same field system rather than do it. And so over however long it took, which we don't know how many years this represents between here and here, but it just reflects up those patterns up through time. Here's another picture of that same field set of canals. You can see the upper one right here, berm. There's a berm right here. Lower one here, ditch, berm, berm. And then on each side is fields. So it's amazing. And the floodplain down there is just that, everywhere you go, it's all fields. People have been growing corn down there for over 5,000 years. So everywhere you go, there's evidence of folks doing stuff in the floodplain. Here's another example. This is the fields that had the footprints right here. So there's the main big ditch there. There's another one right here. And then there's lateral ditches that run along. All the little green things are planting pits. And then here, you see all these things? It looks like people have been walking around in the mud. Those are footprints. Those are prehistoric footprints. They're not modern footprints. Those are the prehistoric footprints of the farmers. We had a spot where we could see there were people walking from over here in this corner, and they walked laterally across the field to this place. In these corners is where they would dig a hole through the mud berm, open it up, and run the water into the fields. So we could see what direction the water was coming from. These are in the CDO. So they're not in, this isn't in the Santa Cruz floodplain, although that right down there is the Santa Cruz River back there. It's right near it. But the water they were watering these fields with was coming down the CDO. We can tell it by the color of sediments. And so that's one of the things. Every flood that comes down, well, floods coming down the Santa Cruz have a different color sediment than the floods coming down the CDO and the floods coming down the Rillito, because there's different geology in those places. So it's really cool. So here we are out. We were doing we brought in all kinds of volunteers. They came out and helped us dig. And so we're exposing the footprints and the berms of those fields on that site. There's a artist's reconstruction of field cells. So you got your ditch running with the water, then you turn the water down a lateral ditch, and then they would just open them up and run them into the fields. This is kind of inaccurate. They were more in the corners. And oftentimes they open these up into the next field cell, so they water both of these at the same time. It's really cool. There's footprints from in the fields, and you can see the squish out around them. It was amazing. And this is one where the person was wearing a sandal, so there's no toes in it. It's just sort of a rectangular, but the squish marks were phenomenal. So they came. We had folks that do casts, that make casts of things. So they cast a whole bunch of these footprints, and Tona Odom out at Himdog Key, their museum and stuff out. They have them all stored out there. The Indians were they loved it. It was amazing. It was really good. They just got super excited about it because you can just see the actual people walking around doing it in the fields. Even though everything is made by people, it just brings it right to home. And so we had tours, so thousands of people here in Tucson got to go through and look at that. Maybe some of you guys went out and looked at it. I don't know. Here we have more pictures of the fields. We'd wear socks. We wouldn't wear our shoes, so we didn't disturb the dirt very much. But so these fields you're looking at, the age range of this, we believe, is around 3,000 years ago in that age range. So it's nothing like the stuff out at White Sands over in New Mexico, but that's right, this is right here. And underneath this set of fields, there's about I believe they're up to like 12 or 13 layers of fields buried underneath. And the little bit they did, they went and they looked at a couple of the lower ones. They could see footprints in those too. So it's pretty amazing. So I'm just going to go into like looking at archaeological features, like other features kinds of things. So this is a fire hearth right here where we stripped over it. Oops. We stripped over it with the backhoe. Oops. There we go. We stripped over it with the backhoe, and this is charcoal. So we could see this charcoal, and we could see the outline of this pit. Outside it, it's just the clean sediments. So we strip down till we can see it. We spray paint a line, and then we bring in our archaeologists, and they come out and they dig it by hand with trowels and brooms and stuff, and take samples out of it. So the charcoal is really good for us. That's what we get our dates out of. That's where we get our corn that we get. So in the floodplain, things like corn do not preserve. They're going to rot. It's going to go away unless it's burnt. If it's burnt, then we'll find them. So we'll take our dirt, we'll take a sample of this dirt with the charcoal, and we'll float it in a bucket or in a machine. Charcoal floats to the top, we scoop it off, then we go in and we look through it and we pick out corn, pollen, we can pick out all these, not pollens, but we pick out corn, seeds, anything preserved like that. And then when we see annuals, anything that's annuals, corn, maybe squash seeds, things like that. At this time period, we do not have beans yet. We don't see beans. We see mesquite beans. They're definitely using lots of mesquite beans, cholla buds. We see all the native plants are being used, but we don't see the domesticated beans coming in yet. But that's a good example of what a fire hearth looks like when you excavate it, or a pit. And there's lots of pits. These guys didn't have pottery, but they had baskets, so they were using baskets for everything. Well, we don't see the baskets unless it's burnt. We find a fragment of them, but we do find these large storage pits. This pit is very big, and you can see layers of how it filled in and washed in. This is called a bell-shaped pit. The bottom of the pit is much bigger in diameter than the top of the pit. It's like a container. And so these pits have been found that were just filled with corn that combusted, that spontaneously combusted, and all the corn in it is just burned, but since there was no oxygen to it, it didn't ash out, so we can find that corn that way too. There was a project that found a bell pit like this that was so full of corn, they only collected a little bit. They just had to throw the rest away. There was so much. But it was all charred. There were little bugs in there. Everything gets kind of preserved. That gives you an idea how big some of those pits are. You could spend a week digging one of these things. They're so big. There's more dirt in one of those big bell pits sometimes than in a pit house that you're digging. Do you guys know what a pit house is? Want to talk about that? So a pit house is when people would build a house, they would dig a hole in the ground, and then they would build a house out of that hole. These houses were built out of like willow, riverine materials, and then thatched with grasses and reeds. And then mud was put over the roof of them. So I've got some examples of that too. Here are some pit houses we excavated out there at Los Capas. So we have, oops, I went the wrong way. So we stripped with the backhoe, we could see the outline of the house, so then we come in and dig them. This was a very shallow house. These holes you see running around the outside, those are post holes for outer posts that went around the outside of the house. And then they would have bent them over and tied them off across the top, and then they would have thatched it. This is a storage pit, and that is a storage pit in that house. And then down here you have another house. It's a little deeper. It's round, had a storage pit here and here. This one's weird because it kind of goes into the wall, but it was contemporary with this house. This house burned down. So we found lots of lumps of burned mud from the roof of that house when it burned down, and the charcoal across it, which gives us good dates. It was loaded with groundstone. It was like they abandoned it, or they accidentally burnt it down and they just left everything in it. And then here's another house that wasn't burnt so heavily right there, but it has a nice storage pit in it. We thought there was going to be a house right here, but we couldn't make any sense out of it. Sometimes you're just too chewed up, and you just can't, because of rodents, all kinds of different things like that. These round houses like this one right here, this is maybe a little bit later. That's like from the Cienega time period, about 1,500 to 2,000 years ago. This was San Pedro right here, which is about 2,000 to 3,000, 3,500 in age. And these dates, and I'm kind of simplifying it down because it's more complicated than what I'm telling you, but in this time frame, it's way. these are just general rough dates. We can't get really good dates on this stuff to really tie it as tight as ceramics. In the later Hohokam time period, pottery changes through time much quicker. And so we can determine pottery types by the way they paint them and the way they make them. And then we can date them to like a couple hundred years or a 50-year time period if we're really lucky, things like that. But at this time period, it's in bigger swaths of time. So here's an example of that pit house that we built over here at Steam Pump Ranch. This is what that little roundhouse you saw in the last picture, that's what it may have looked like. They would have been, these little beams would have went up around the edges, and then it was thatched with reeds and grass, and then mud placed over the top of the roof. We burned this one down a number of years ago. It was super exciting. And if you go to Archaeology Southwest website, our YouTube channel, that video is on there. You can watch the video of us burning it down.
Excuse me, why did you burn it down?
Well, so we find so many of these prehistoric houses burned down. We wanted to see, like, well, how easy is it to do that? Or why would you do that, you know? And so, because you think you'd be really careful. And there's a lot of different theories. One theory is that maybe somebody died in the house, and then they destroy it. And you would leave all the artifacts in there. So you'll find burned down pit houses that have nothing in them, and you find burned down pit houses with everything in them. It would have been very easy to go back into a house that's burned down and pull out things like metates and manos and maybe whole pots that you could still reuse. But in a lot of cases, they did not. They just left them in there. It was finished. So it's a way of closing it off and sealing it off. So that was kind of one of the big reasons we wanted to do that. And then these little grass houses like this, these Cienega period houses, you know, they are thatched with the grass, and we find them burned down where we get parts of the walls still, they burn, they collapse, and then the dirt on top collapses on top of it and smothers it so it doesn't ash out. So we can actually see those construction details, like the vertical posts, the interior posts. We can find the bases of those in the floor where they go into the floor. So from that's what these are based on, from the parts of the burned ones that we find. Here's another house. This is a representation of a historic O'odham Key. This is the Salt River Indian community up in Phoenix, and they have a little museum, and we built this house up there. She is putting arrowweed into the walls right now, thatching it. And so we just remodeled this house again. I have a little blog post about that on our blog, on our Archaeology Southwest website you can check out. I've been working on this house with these guys for like 4 or 5 years now. It's pretty cool. Here we are. This is at Los Capas. After we had exposed the fields, we thought it would be really fun to go in and replant a field. So we went in and built berms around it, and then they're using digging sticks, and then they planted corn, and we grew some corn up out in there. And we had stripped acres out here. I can't remember how many acres this locust was. And we planted the corn, and those critters would get it. The rodents and things would come in. I would think there would be no way they'd be coming in there, but the rabbits were coming in. So we had to put little cages around the corn just to get it up that high. But what we were doing is we were having to bring the water out. We just had a water truck, little hopper with water that we were watering it to keep it going. It was just fun. But one of the things you can see about these fields here, do you see how there's so much clay in these fields that when it dries, it cracks up really, really bad. This would have not been great for them growing corn in it. But all this clay that's in these fields, this clay came in through time from them running water out of the Santa Cruz in the spring. When there's suspended clay particles in the water, you run it into your fields, the clay particles settle into your fields. So over time, they get saturated with clay, and it reaches a point where you can't hardly keep your fields going because the ground cracks. You get those cracks, and if you get a good rainstorm, the water runs down those cracks, and you'll hit another layer of clay down below that's impenetrable, and then it'll run vertical, and it runs to wherever the river channel is, or the river channel. And that's the beginnings of downcutting, of erosion. And so we were finding out when we were excavating in these fields, we'd find all these features. They were regularly shaped. Sometimes they're kind of linear, And they had trash in them. They had artifacts in them, but they weren't perfectly round. They weren't like your normal features. And sometimes they went deep. We thought, oh, we got wells. These are wells where they were digging to get water in dry times. But after a while, one day, Fred finally realized, dope. They're called piping vents. So if you've ever been walking down along a river or any of these places, you'll see places where these holes open up in the ground, and then there's a little channel that runs off. That's the beginning of down cutting. And so the water has gone down a crack, maybe a rodent hole, maybe an earth crack where the ground dried, and then it runs and it follows, it goes, whatever the topography is, it goes downhill and it starts cutting. And so if you have a ditch in your fields, one of your agricultural watering ditches, if you have one of those ditches go into one of those sinkholes, we call them piping vents. If you have one of those ditches go into that and you don't catch it in time, it'll ruin your canal, your fields. It'll erode it out, and you'll have to dig a whole new canal around to get around that because you can't fill it in. Once that's going, it's almost impossible to stop. They didn't use any rocks or anything in these fields. It's all mud. It's all berms. So they had to be on top of it. So here's just an example. I'm going to go into artifacts right now. So through most of the early ag time period, the weapon was the atlatl. And the atlatl, I'm pretty partial to atlatls. And I have one up here in a dart. And oftentimes we'll have them out at Steam Pump Ranch. And you guys can all try them out. They're super fun. But it's just a stick with a hook on one end. And then you throw a long spear. That's this guy right here, a long spear like that. And then when they made their projectile points, they hafted them to a short stick that socketed into the front end of the dart, like up here. And so I have some, we call them foreshafts, so I have some up here. So they made a much larger projectile point than we see later in time. With the bow and arrow, projectile points are very tiny. They're shooting a very small projectile, where with the atlatl darts, they're shooting a much larger projectile point that when you hit an animal, it does a lot of damage. You can only do one shot at a time unless you've got multiple hunters, because the animal's going to be gone. But we do get deer of the medium game. We don't really get super large game, but we get deer, we get bighorn sheep, and out on the perimeters of Tucson from time to time you will see antelope in some sites, some antelope bones. So they were kind of around. There's no bison, there's nothing like that, and there's no javelina. Zero. Javelina weren't here yet. They're of recent. They've came in the last 50 to 75 years. You go look at old westerns. You never see anybody talking about hunting a javelina in one of those, you know. That gives you an idea how really recent it is that they have come in. Here's some projectile points. These are from Los Pozos, which is another site. This is down off of Roger Road, down in there underneath the other sewer plant that they've now closed down. But this one, you can see the 3 different time periods of projectile points. You've got, well, this has like 3 basically. These are all San Pedro projectile points. They're made out of rhyolite. This rhyolite comes out of the Tucson Mountains on the north end out there off of Ina. It's horrible. I hate flint knapping it. I hate working it, but they were doing it. And then you've got some Cienega points. So these are early Cienega points right here. These are all Cienega. And they're corner notched, and they're arrow points. They're much smaller than your dart points. And there's some thought that these continue too. And it seems like in Cienega times they are making points like this, but probably what they are is knives. They're using them as knives for that kind of a thing. And then you go, these right here, these points right here are our early ceramic points in this corner right here. These are like the earliest hohokam kind of projectile points. So when you dig a site, you're going to get all these things mixed together because you've got a lot of layers. And there's rodents, and things come, and they move, and they go up and down. So you might find a late prehistoric projectile point down in a San Pedro level, but it's just because of biotremation. So it's important to pay close attention to what you're doing when you're digging. Here's some replica points I did that are hafted to foreshafts, and you can look at some of them up here. I do a lot of experimental archaeology where we make things like this, and then we go shoot them, or shoot them with the darts, break them, and study the breakage. So by making them and studying them, you can learn a lot at what you're looking at when you're excavating these sites. You go like, well, why did they do it like this? Well, you look at it that way, and then you can go, this makes sense. These are hafted this way, and blah, 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 blah. This is another San Pedro point. So in the early ag stuff, interestingly enough, we do get some clay artifacts. We get these figurine fragments. And so these are made of clay, and we think that they're accidentally fired. We don't think that they're firing them on purpose, but they're just in pit houses and things that get burned down. These are all just fragments of some of them right here, just pieces. And then we get shell. There's a shell trade coming in, and we see a little bit of shell. Not as much as later on during the Hohokam times when there's tons of shell coming in, but we see quite a bit. But this rock that this point is made out of is non-local. So we can see projectile points that are made out of stuff that's like, well, where's that from? Well, I don't know, but it could possibly find something like that in the Santa Cruz, but it's kind of unlikely. Wrong button. There we go. Okay, so here's a cool one. This is a early ag figurine from the Empire phase, which is the early San Pedro. So this is between more like 3.5, almost 4,000 years old in this style right here. And that's the only one I've ever seen that was intact that we found in a pit house. And you can see it's a female effigy. And then later in time, in San Pedro times, you start getting the figurines that look like this. And it's like they're taking two of these guys and they're sticking them together, creating one figure. And they're pretty graphic almost. They're real interesting. You can interpret them however you want, but they're... And then, so in the early ag time periods, as opposed to later on in time, their metates and the monos that they used and made are different than what we see later on in Hohokam times. In the earlier time periods, the metates, they're slab-like, and they have a basin in them, and they're using a single one-handed mono to grind their corn with in them. This is another example where it's a basin metate where they're grinding the corn with a single-handed mono in them. And these are both from Los Capas right here. Actually, this is not. These are ones that I've gotten that I've found in the Santa Cruz. But like we had a spot at Los Capas where we had a whole bunch of groundstone came out of a pit house that was all made out of quartz. It's like, yikes, making that. So groundstone, when you make that, you're taking another rock and you peck it. You're pecking, shaping it out. Quartz flakes, it's breakable, it'll fall apart. So they had to be really careful to do that. It's not what you typically see. Here's some more examples. This is a stone bowl that we see in the early ag. A lot of these stone bowls that we see have knobs on them here. And we don't see those later on. They're just at that period of time. But these may be a precursor to the Hohokam pallets, which you may have seen. They made these trays. There were elaborate decorations around them. It's possible. It's a guess. Who knows? Another thing we'll find in these sites these are scapula. These are not actually from here. These are from up in Utah, but we find exactly the same kind of artifact. These are elk scapula that they've serrated down an edge. Both of these are serrated down the edge. They were found laying next to each other, one on top of the other. And these teeth, they're used for gathering seeds. They're like rakes. So you'd have a basket and you pull your grass over and you rake those rakes through it to get the seeds out. These teeth and the notches in there were polished, just polished so beautifully just from that running it through grasses, which have a high silica content, and really polish off. This is a pipe. It's made out of vesicular basalt, has a hole pecked in here and a hole pecked in from the other end. And there you have a cone here and a cone, and they meet in the middle, so you have a narrow spot. And then they would put a bone tube, pack it in with clay on one end, and they were like cloud blowers. So we see cloud blowers in the Pueblo and stuff up north, but down here, once you get through into Cienega times, you don't see these pipes anymore. And there are no pipes in Hohokam stuff, except for this one I'm showing you, which I found on a floor of a pit house down along Silver Bell a couple years ago in a Hohokam pit house. But it's something that they picked up. They didn't make them and use them. They just said, wow, this is neat. It's an heirloom. Who knows what they thought, but they're rare. Like, that's the only one I've ever seen come out of a Hohokam house. And I just thought it was a rock on the floor for the longest time. I was mapping the house, and then it was like, oh my gosh, it's a pipe. So that was cool. So this right here are some beads that are made out of spiny oyster. that were traded in, which has a bright orange color in it, in its shell, and then 2 turquoise beads. This was a necklace we found. We were out digging fields in the middle of Los Capas, in the middle of nowhere. We're out scraping with the machine, digging along. Boom, one of these beads pops up. So I just happened to be monitoring them, like stuck a flag in, collected it. Said, I'll come back and explore this spot. So once we got done with that layer of fields and exposed them, I went back and went to look to see if there was anything more around there. And I scraped all the dirt away, nothing, but I left a little bulk of dirt like that around the pin flag. So I thought, I better check that. Stuck the pin flag in, first scrape, bam! That turquoise bead popped out, and I cracked it and broke it. It was like, oh! But scraping through that little mound of dirt, I think there was 11 or 12 beads that were in there. And these are very typical of the early ag. They were drilled from, there was a hole that goes in here and a hole in here. They're not like your later beads. It was man, that necklace would have been beautiful. It was amazing. And then here's some more examples from Los Pozos, Cienega times more beads. We get a slightly different style of beads than we get later on in the Hohokam stuff, and different shells, but these are olivella right here, and those are common all throughout. We see olivellas all the way through. But it shows you got that trade going on already. Oh, I might be at the end right there, you guys.